Good evening and welcome to our live talk this evening titled How Jesus Changed the World. I'm going to be introducing our guest speaker in just a moment, but what I want to do before that is just give you, I guess, a few housekeeping announcements so that you can settle into tonight's event and be able to engage and participate as well. Now, obviously, you're streaming with us, you're watching on YouTube. Feel free to pop in the comment section any kind of responses or questions, whatever you may have throughout the event. But I want to introduce you, if you haven't yet seen this before, to a software we're using called Slido. So I'm just going to get some slides up so that we can see this right now and see together what I'm talking about. So the first one right here. So you can join tonight's event and actually interact and engage with us. You can post questions as well that we will be answering later on during the Q&A section. And how you do that, you've got two ways. Firstly, you can scan the QR code on your right, or simply go to slido.com, entering the event code HJCW. And so you can see all those details there. And what you'll see when you go on Slido is you'll see the option to be able to ask questions and be able to engage with the talk. So the whole time the talk is happening, Slido will be running in the background. So you can, anytime you get a question throughout the talk, you could just pop that right into Slido. And what's going to happen is after the talk is finished, we're going to have a section of Q&A at the very end. And we'll be going off of the questions you've asked during the talk. So you can post any questions on there. What we are asking is primarily questions related to tonight's talk and topic. That would be great. But if there is something burning on your heart and you put it on there, then perhaps we'll be able to get to that as well. But what we do is we'll vote on the questions. So the questions that you guys want to hear answered will rise to the top and we will answer those questions. Two other quick announcements before we move on. The first here we go. Okay, there we go. First is we have a live book reading by our very own Randall Porter. He has written a book called Evidence for Conviction, a detective's journey into examining the credibility of the Christian faith. And next Thursday is going to be a live book reading 7 to 8 on Zoom. If you want the link for that, just send us a direct message either here on YouTube or on our Instagram or Facebook, and we'll be able to send you the link for that. The next one as well is we have a Warzone tournament. If you are a Warzone player or you know someone who is, we have a charity tournament running next Saturday evening from 6 till 10. It's £5 a person for teams of 3. So it's £15 a team. All the money goes to charity, and all the other details are online on Eventbrite. So again, if you're really interested in that, please send us a link. You'll see some links on our YouTubes and Facebook and everything else. But it'd be great to have as many of you join as possible. So if you haven't done so already, get yourself on Slido so you can ask some questions and engage with our speaker tonight. And without further ado, I would love to introduce you to Dr. Andy Boakye. And I'm going to invite him to the screen now. So I'm going to stop sharing, and he's going to join us on the screen in just a moment. Good evening, Andy.
Hello, Jack. Lovely to be here.
It is great to have you here. Thank you so much for giving your time.
Pleasure.
And, for preparing a talk to us. So you've got a talk on how Jesus changed the world. Is that right?
Yeah, this is it's not a talk I've done before, but it relates to what's called Christology, which is the study of Jesus and particularly the nature of Jesus in modern cultural context, which is one of my research interests.
Wow, fantastic. All right. And for those who don't know you well, obviously you're a lecturer in religions and theology and a researcher in New Testament exegesis. Did I get that right?
Yes, so I teach religions and theology at the University of Manchester. My sort of main specialism is study of the Apostle Paul, which I wrote my doctoral thesis on, and my first book was on Galatians. In fact, my next book, which is out in February, is also on Galatians. It's called Rethinking Galatians, and that's due to be published by Bloomsbury in February of next year.
Wow, fantastic. Wow, that's incredible. And obviously on top of that, you're You're a husband, you're a father, and obviously a disciple of Jesus as well.
Yes, indeed. I am a disciple. I have been for, oh, blimey, I was baptized on Halloween's Day, would you believe it? Halloween's
wow, okay.
Day, 1993. And I am married to Chi, and we have 2 children, Aaron, who's 18, and Storm, who is 16.
Wow, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you to them as well for allowing them for lending you to us. So we're really excited to hear you talk. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. I know you've got some slides as well, but yeah, take us away. Thanks so much, Andy. Actually, you know what? I'm going to say a real quick prayer just before we start.
Great.
And just we can begin then.
Okay.
God, thank you so much for this time together. Thank you for an opportunity to gather virtually. And thank you so much for Andy as well, being able to be here and give his time to helping us this evening. I do pray that we're all able to engage this evening. And perhaps some of us, even as I'm praying, maybe some of us are not even sure you exist, Lord. Maybe some of us aren't sure about Jesus or even why we're here or what this is all about. I pray that for all of us, we're all able to take something away from tonight's event in some way that is able to point us to you, build our faith, or perhaps just get some questions and doubts answered as well. I pray you speak to us. I pray you guide us. And I pray you help provide just an incredible evening tonight. And you speak through Andy as well. Lord, we love you. We thank you. And we pray in your son's name. Amen.
Amen.
Fantastic. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully you can all see this. Okay, then. Well, first of all, good evening, East London Church and guests and everybody. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks very much to Jack and to Paul and to everyone else who organised this evening. As Jack said, I really do hope that you can take something away from what I share this evening. This is something which I talk about sort of now and again. I've never talked about it in quite this format before. But it seems to me that it is virtually impossible to be neutral about Jesus. As this series of quotations from a Newsweek article a few Christmases ago suggests. The first one there is from someone from Alcoholics Anonymous. The second one, Jesus is about as real as Santa Claus, a tooth fairy, or King Arthur. The third one says that Jesus should be pitied, not worshipped. The fourth one that says Jesus is a fairy tale for grown-ups. Unfortunately, he's one that leads people to bomb clinics, despise women, denigrate reason, and embrace greed. And the last one is actually from a biblical scholar, Bart Ehrman, who says that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who bet wrong and died as a result. It seems that everybody has something to say about Jesus. A bit of say what you see. Well, this is not a screen you'd expect to see in a talk on Jesus. There are 4 things on the screen. If I tell you that there's only one of these things that Jesus has not been compared to in an extant text, but that is actually the case. What we got here, we've got some mushrooms, we've got some dainty-looking magician, the archangel Gabriel, and the Hindu god Vishnu. I usually do this slide when I'm teaching my students on one of our Jesus courses that we teach at the university. And in fact, the only one that Jesus has not been compared to, would you believe, is the Archangel Gabriel. He has been compared to the Archangel Michael, and the Jehovah's Witnesses still to this day believe that Jesus is an incarnation of the Archangel Michael. However, Jesus has been compared to the Hindu god Vishnu. Apparently, he's an avatar of Vishnu, according to one of the Vedic texts, one of the Puranas. A Semitic scholar called Morton Smith claimed that Jesus was a gay magician. He takes that story from Mark 14, where Jesus is arrested and that one follower of Jesus runs away and the Roman police grab the hem of his robe and he runs off naked. Well, Morton Smith claims that that person was someone who Jesus discussed the mysteries of the kingdom with, and they eventually had some kind of affair. And yes, would you believe it? Jesus has been compared to ancient mushrooms. A chap called John Allegro wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, where he claimed that Jesus was not actually a real person, but rather a hallucinogenic mushroom, which when the apostles smoked, they wrote the New Testament in a state of euphoria. As I said, it seems it's impossible for people to remain neutral about Jesus. But we all know who this is. David Icke, who began life as a 3rd division goalkeeper, Then a knee injury ended his footballing career, and he sort of had a promotion to a TV sports presenter. Those of you who remember Grandstand and World of Sport back in the days, David Icke was presenting sports television on BBC One. But then in the early 90s, he had a major career boost when he became the Son of God. Yet he went on Terry Wogan's show and claimed that he was some kind of incarnation of Jesus who had been sent with a special message. Ancient writers wrote about Jesus, ancient writers outside of the biblical canon. Pliny, the governor of Bithynia, writing to Emperor Trajan around the turn of the 2nd century, wrote that the Christians were a group who gathered to sing verses to Christ as if singing to a god. Cornelius Tacitus, in his Annals, writing about the time when Nero blamed the fire of Rome on the Christians, claimed that Christus was the founder of that name and was put to death under the auspices of Pontius Pilate. And the Roman writer Suetonius, in his Life of Claudius, mentions the time that the Jews were expelled from Rome. It's mentioned by Luke in Acts 18, verses 1 to 3. And says that this happened at the instigation of Chrestus, which most writers believe is a misspelling of Jesus's name. And even non-canonical Jewish texts write about Jesus. In the Babylonian Talmud, we're told on the eve of Passover, Yeshua was hanged on a cross for leading Israel astray and tempting them with apostasy. It does seem that there is no end of speculation about who Jesus is. Scholars have even are routinely writing new attempts of describing Jesus, of trying to understand his person, his work, what he did, his impact. And there is no shortage of these books. There is no one probably who's been written about more than Jesus, and the books just keep on coming. So the argument I want to present today then, just that very simple survey shows that Jesus has had a huge impact on the human consciousness. I want to suggest through 3 lines of argument that Jesus has had an unparalleled effect on the world. That in Jesus, in a historical religion, it is believed that God came among us. Secondly, Jesus was a pioneer of championing the marginalized classes in the world. And as such, paved the way for charity and for care for the unfortunate. And thirdly, in his resurrection, the central belief which instigated the birth of the church, that Jesus overcame death and therefore provided an answer to humanity's darkest question. Gods appear in all sorts of forms in the ancient world. Stoicism was a particularly attractive belief in the ancient world. And Stoics believed that the whole universe was joined together, that the whole universe was one thing, and that's what they called God. And they believed that this God thing was made of this fiery substance called pneuma. Pneuma is the Greek word for spirit. And pneuma was joined together by this cohesive principle, this organizing principle, which they called the Logos. We know that the author of the 4th Gospel, the Apostle John, who knew Jesus personally, wrote this about Jesus in the prologue to his Gospel. He said, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. This one was with God from the beginning. And then down in verse 14, he writes, and the Logos became flesh and set up a tabernacle in our midst. The word Logos is normally translated word in most English translations of the New Testament. But John, having experienced Jesus, and of course having been influenced by Greek philosophy like Stoic philosophy, understood and came to express Jesus as that very unifying principle. Having experienced and walked with Jesus, John wrote that Jesus is the principle that holds the entire universe together. And this is what we constantly see in the ancient texts. People who experienced Jesus, this preacher from Galilee, knew that they were not just experiencing an ordinary human being. The author of Hebrews says that, look, God's spoken to us in all sorts of ways through the prophets, but now something different's happened. Now he's spoken to us in his Son. And who is this Son? Well, according to verse 3 here, he is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his nature. And the Greek word for exact representation there is the Greek word character, from where we get the English word character from. He is the very character of God. He's the reflection of God. The Hebrew author talking about Jesus, saying, when you experience this person, you know that this is just not another prophet. This is something more. Matthew said a similar thing in a verse that's about to become seasonally appropriate when talking about the birth of Jesus. He says that the son that will be born will be named Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. Matthew, another eyewitness and friend and personal emissary of Jesus, who experienced Jesus and said, this is not just a prophet, this is God with us. And these, bear in mind, were Jewish men, Jewish writers who believed fiercely that there is only one God, and that the idols of the pagan world were all imaginary, fictitious characters, but the one true God created everything and has always existed. And yet when they experienced Jesus, they experienced something way more than just another prophet. The Apostle Paul writes in Colossians 1 verse 15 that this was the very image of the God that you can't see. Ancient Christian writers of the 4th and 3rd and even 2nd centuries, Athanasius, the great 4th century bishop, wrote that we might receive a conception of the unseen Father when we experience Jesus. The 3rd century Christian philosopher Novatian writes that Christ was said to be in the form of God, not just the image of God. All these writers were attempting to put into words this one central and enigmatic truth, that when people experienced Jesus, this was not just another human being, something considerably more powerful was going on. As we see in the way Paul writes, and he does this routinely, Paul will often be describing Jesus and use the language of the Old Testament, which speaks about God. In Philippians 2, when he says at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and that every tongue will confess, he's virtually quoting Isaiah 45, which is one of the most fiercely monotheistic passages in the entire Hebrew Bible, where God routinely says, there is no God but me. And he says that, and I have sworn by myself, the word has gone out from my mouth in righteousness and will not turn back, that to me, that is to God himself, every knee will bow, every tongue will swear. It's very clear what Paul's doing here. It's incredibly controversial, but it's very clear. Paul is using the language that the Hebrew Bible used of God to speak about Jesus. This is unprecedented in the ancient world, in a historical religion, not one that's based on lots of fables and myths, but in a historical religion, one which is fiercely monotheistic. We're talking about Jewish men who routinely prayed the Jewish Shema, the prayer that's encapsulated in Deuteronomy 6 verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God. The Lord your God is one, not two, not three. The Lord your God is one. And you shall worship the Lord your God with all your heart and your mind and your soul and your strength. That's what these men believed. And yet when they experienced Jesus, they were conscious of that very same God, the creator God who'd made everything. Either something, these Jews had lost their minds, and suddenly after years, centuries of belief of one God, suddenly decided that this God was somehow housed in a human being, or something else more miraculous and more powerful had happened, and that in some way God was housed in Christ. So when Philip asked Jesus to show us the Father, Jesus answers simply that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. There could be no clearer way of saying it. Now, sometimes people ask, well, did Jesus ever claim to be God? Well, of course he didn't. If he didn't want to be thrown into a nut house, you wouldn't go around saying, I am God. But Jesus says the kinds of things which lead someone to believe, and of course perform the kinds of deeds which lead someone to believe, led these Jewish people, these Jewish men and women to believe in their heart of hearts that this experience was not the same as just being with someone speaking on behalf of God. This was something more. God had in some way come amongst the people. Secondly, then, Jesus embraced the marginalized. This is something central in understanding Christology, especially in cultural context of today. Jesus was a pioneer of what has effectively led to the whole notion and practice of charity, caring for marginalized classes, caring for the less fortunate, considering the needs of people on the fringes of society, people who don't fit into some of the dominant paradigms, people who, for whatever reason, feel frozen out. The life and the work and the mission of Jesus was one of the key aspects in the development of humanity, for people changing these kinds of views, which were very prevalent in the ancient world of marginalizing certain classes of people. And so Jesus says in Matthew 20, verse 16, and in numerous other places, that the last will be first and the first will be last. It was like he was turning the very culture of the world on its head. In Luke 7, where Jesus is anointed by a woman whose hair is out and she's crying on his feet, and the Pharisee who's invited Jesus around for dinner is thinking to himself, what on earth is this so-called prophet doing? Doesn't he know that this woman is a sinner? Now, there's nothing there to suggest she's a prostitute or that she's Mary Magdalene, as some people like to say, but clearly this was a woman who was considered sinful, certainly on the margins of society. And yet Jesus embraces her. Now, this is doubly important because in the ancient world, certain classes of people were routinely marginalized, looked down on, and considered inferior. Women were, and children and the disabled, the three classes I'll talk about, were all considered inferior. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, writing about a time when he was completely disillusioned with life, asked himself, whose soul inhabits me at the moment? A child, a woman, a tyrant, a dumb ox, or a wild beast? In Marcus Aurelius's mind, they were all of the same class. Even the Jewish writer of the Wisdom of Solomon denigrates children on the basis that they can't reason. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing about women's relation to the Jewish law, says the woman, says the law, is in all things inferior to the man. Let her accordingly be submissive, not for her humiliation, but that she may be directed, for the authority has been given by God to the man. This story, it was too long to write out, so I've just summarized it, but it's a funny story that the ancient Roman historian Livy writes, and it typifies views of ancient Roman men on their women. He tells a story of a men's only party. And at this party, when all the men were drunk, they started bragging about how chaste their wives were and how pure their wives were. And again, this was typical. And your average Roman wife was expected to be chaste and pure. Then they started gambling on whose wife was the most virtuous. In the end, when they all went home, all of them but one, their wife was about to go off and meet with her lover. Now, this story illustrates a number of things, but what's most interesting about it is how Roman men viewed women. They were considered weak-willed, incapable of maintaining virtue, and basically needed men to exist. This is absolutely typical of the ancient Roman world. Things changed in certain quarters, but it was very, very typical of the Roman world. And ancient views on disability were no less shocking. In the 12 Tables, which is the earliest record that we have of a Roman law system, says that a dreadfully deformed child should be killed, and infanticide, killing children, especially female children who were considered the lowest of the low, again, seems to be a common practice. There's some debate amongst historians about how common it was, but it was known for people to leave babies on the sides of mountains or the sides of roads just to die because life was cheap and they were not considered important. Dionysius of Halicarnassus says that one of the founders of Rome, Romulus, had a law which only allowed the killing of children if they were disabled under the age of 3. And the Stoic writer and former tutor of Nero, Seneca, says a similar thing. He says that we drown even children who were at birth are weakly and abnormal. So Jesus then provides an absolutely revolutionary takes a revolutionary stance. In Matthew 19, he rebukes the disciples for trying to shoo the children away. And he says, no, let them come to me. He then says something incredibly shocking. He says the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. The kingdom of heaven was this great inbreaking of the divine presence into the world, the great rulership of God, which was about to somehow captivate all of humanity, was about to change the world and put it all back to rights. And yet Jesus said the people who were in the best position to receive what God was doing were children who were the lowest on the rung on the social ladder in the Roman world. In a later Christian text, the Epistle of Barnabas, in chapter 19, the author is doing some reflection on the Sermon on the Mount. And he writes there that thou shalt not murder a child by abortion. Again, it was a very common practice in the ancient world. We won't talk about how it was done. Nor again shalt thou kill it when it is born. And in fact, it was pressure from the early church that effectively ended the practice of infanticide in the empire. Jesus's relationship with women, again, was not only revolutionary, but shocking in his context. In the beginning of Luke chapter 8, women were said to be the backbone of Jesus's ministry. They were the ones who provided the purse, basically did the work, while the apostles would preach the gospel. Paul followed suit. In Romans 16, verse 7, he mentions Junia and refers to this woman as an apostle. Yes, there were female apostles. That's controversial, but we think it's true. And of course, he mentions Euodia and Syntyche in Philippians 4. Paul again makes this extraordinary statement in Galatians 3 in verses 26 through 28. Everyone who's been baptized into Christ has taken on this new kind of status in Christ. And within that status, there's neither Jew nor Gentile. There's no racial dominance either way. There's no slave nor free. There's no classism, nor is there male and female. There's no sexism, for you are all one in Christ. No Roman would believe this. No Roman would believe that a slave and their master could somehow be equals. But in Jesus' mind, they were. And of course, the apostles were shocked to see Jesus talking to a woman in John chapter 4. But Jesus wasn't held by these sorts of traditions. He wasn't held back by Jewish traditions and Jewish law. He would routinely reach out to marginalized classes, as we see him doing again here in Matthew 8. He's willing to touch this leper and cure him, even though it made him, according to the law, ritually unclean. And similarly, he was willing to heal this disabled man with a shriveled hand on the Sabbath in Matthew 12. And consequently, Jesus's impact on so much of human life, whether it's charity and compassion, the origins of education for the young, hospitals and healthcare, the abolition of slavery, the very sanctity of human life. Life was cheap. Jesus changed the world because of the way he treated marginalized classes. It was an absolute turning point in history that life meant something, and not just the lives of the rich and the powerful, but the lives of the poor and the downtrodden. But the final way I want to suggest that Jesus changed the world is that he answered the darkest, thorniest question in the human consciousness, the whole question of death. In many ways, all religion is about death and about the mystery of death. It is the one thing that you can be sure of when you're born. They say the only thing you're being sure of is death and taxes, but definitely death. Paul said it was the last enemy to be destroyed in 1 Corinthians 15. The one thing that we know nothing about, the one thing which still holds sway is death. In many ways, death was introduced at the so-called fall of man. When the author of Genesis tries to describe what happened in the development of the world, death entered the world. Well, Paul writes that life overcame that death. Of course, if death is the problem, then the remedy is life. And Paul writes about how that life was the risen life of Jesus. Death is a mystery. Ancient philosophers wrote about death as a mystery. Plato couldn't decide whether you just stopped existing or there was an afterlife. Similarly, the hedonist Epicurus said that death was the end of existence, which no one can know about, and so shouldn't worry about. And similar things are said by the biblical author of Ecclesiastes and the Roman writer Euripides. The Hebrews author, the author of the biblical book of Hebrews, says this: that since the children have flesh and blood, he too, that is Jesus, shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Death is the great slave master, he says, and fear of death controls people. But Jesus is believed to have overcome death. Even to this day, in South Korea, there's an institution known as the Happy Dying Society, where they organize fake funerals so that people who are struggling with life and struggling with the rat race can sort of go through their own death, because in so doing, they can reflect on what's important in life. So this event, the resurrection of Jesus, is the foundational event in the beginning of the ancient church. And there are good reasons for believing in its reality. First of all, Paul writing about this, Paul joined the Jesus movement within a year to 18 months after Jesus' execution. And he says that he received this creed that he passes on to others, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried and raised on the third day. There was no time for legends to develop. There was no time for fanciful stories to develop. And the idea that 500 people all had the same hallucination at the same time just beggars belief. It's beyond ridiculous. And of course, Paul making that statement is to invite people to check his facts. You know, we hear about fact checking all the time these days. And even this call to check his facts, again, it's very rare, virtually unprecedented in the ancient world. But that the resurrection lay at the very heart of ancient Jesus movement belief is virtually assured. Something must have happened to get these Jewish believers, these Jewish Christians, and of course all the early Christians were Jews, to not so much change their Sabbath, but certainly change the day of their worship. And this was a cultural change, not just a change of habit. But the evidence in the texts in that first paragraph there show that these Jews who normally celebrated the Sabbath were now worshipping on a different day. They were worshipping on the first day of the week. It seems it was because of the resurrection. But another reason I think we ought to take the resurrection seriously is that it simply wasn't something that was expected. Some people argue that the resurrection was a story cooked up by the ancient church. But we see here in Mark 16 that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary and Salome went to the tomb, i.e. they expected to find the body there because they went to anoint it. They weren't expecting a resurrection. And the truth is, what does resurrection tell us anyway? You know, the widow of Nain's son came back from the dead, so did Lazarus. Even Emperor Nero was believed to have died and come back to life again in some strange way, shape or form. None of them was suspected of being the Messiah. But as we see in Luke 24, Jesus explaining the scriptures as to why this momentous event actually proved that he was Messiah and vindicated his life and his work. Again, other reasons why it's very difficult to suggest that the resurrection was something cooked up by the early church. All the Gospels say that women were the first witnesses of the resurrection, and women couldn't even give legal testimony in a Jewish context. And so if the church were making this up, they did a dreadful job of it. But perhaps the most persuasive thing to me is the simple existence of the church. How else do you explain the existence of a sect that began within Judaism, outgrew that first context, and then became a group with an independent identity? There would seem to me to be no other explanation. Normally, when movement leaders were killed, the movements died with them. But the church did the opposite thing. The leader was killed and the group exploded. It would seem to me, other than the difficulties that people have with the supernatural, that the resurrection, although a strange explanation, is the one which has the most persuasive power based on the evidence. And so for these three reasons, then, I want to suggest that Jesus has utterly and irrevocably changed the world. That in some way, shape or form, Jesus is God amongst the people. This is the testimony of Jews who only believe in one God. They experienced Christ and knew that this was something more. Jesus celebrated the marginalized classes and ended up becoming a pioneer of charity in all of its forms. In Jesus's death and his resurrection, he overcame the darkest mystery, the greatest fear that humanity has. He is the only person to have gone through death and come out the other side and still lives according to the early church, and those claims need to be taken seriously. I therefore leave the last word to the author H.G. Wells, who says, I'm a historian and not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very center of history. Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all history. Christ is the most unique person of history. No man can write a history of the human race without giving first and foremost place to the penniless teacher of Nazareth. Thank you all for your attention.
Wow. Andy, thank you so much. This would normally be the kind of round of applause moment, which I'm sure
I'm imagining it in my head.
You can imagine it. Imagine the applause. Exactly. That was very powerful. Thank you so much for all that you shared. That was that was very encouraging as well. Just to think and reflect on lots of what you were saying. We also have lots and lots of questions, and I'm sure from Jesus being a mushroom to female apostles and his change of kind of societal dynamic, all kinds of things. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to open Slido here,
okay,
and start getting up some of the questions for us, and you should be able to see those now. Can you see those as well with us, Andy?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So what we do, so people have fielded questions. Again, if you haven't yet got on Slido, speaking to the audience now, you can still do that. You can, the hashtag, the QR code is here on the screen, as well as you could just go to slido.com and type in that code HJCW, and you can ask some questions as well, which we're going to be able to answer for you now. So Andy, thank you again. That was really helpful.
Very welcome.
Lots to chew on and think about. So I'm glad we've got an opportunity to ask you some questions.
Yep.
And, so the first one we've got here, pinned to the top, is if Jesus's aim was to be among us, why was his ministry only a few years long rather than being a longer period where he could spread the mission further? So
that's an excellent question. Well, first of all, let's take a step back a bit, because the truth is we only know from the fourth gospel that Jesus' ministry was a few years long, because the fourth gospel mentions 3 Passovers. The truth is everything that happened in Matthew, Mark and Luke could have happened in 6 months, never mind 3 years. But we generally take those 2.5 to 3.5 years as standard. It would seem to me, well, there are two parts to this question. First of all, consider the way the world has gone with Jesus being with us the time that he was. The world really has descended into a kind of a chaos which really needs fixing, and this is why I think Jesus is still so important today. Had he been around another 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, would it have made that much difference in the choices that people make? Probably not, would be my guess. But here's I think the other thing, which I think is crucially important. It seems that from the beginning, God's intention was that he would work through people. It's our responsibility to try to put things right. Now, ultimately, it is divine work. No human being can reverse the effects of the fall. But God has chosen, right from the moment he chose Israel, and even before then chose Abraham, it's always been his desire to work through people. And again, this is why I think the incarnation is so important and so critical to religion, and why that's part of why I even became a Christian. That it wasn't just, he had sent prophets before. He had sent prophet after prophet after prophet. Many of them were killed. Many of them met grisly ends, according to an apocryphal text called the Assumption of Isaiah. Isaiah was sawn in half whilst he was still alive. I mean, they met pretty grisly ends. So Jesus being amongst us, being the very embodiment of God, as it says in Colossians 1:15 or Colossians 2 verse 9, I think 3 years was about as much as we could take, to be honest, of God being amongst us. But in that time, think of the impact he made. He took 12 people. One of them, even did the dirty on him and ratted him out. So he only had 11 faithful ones left. Yeah. But even just through those 11 people, the Christian church not only started to take a major grip within the Jewish context, but then largely with the ministry of the Apostle Paul, it went beyond Israel's borders. And to this day, 2,000 years later, Jesus is still the most talked about and controversial and admired figure of human history.
Wow. Wow, thank you so much. That's really, really helpful. I think that definitely answers that one. So what we can do is give this a little tick off, and there's some more challenging ones that come. So definitely your one about female apostles struck a chord as well, and also kind of some of these changes. What I might do here is just bunch a couple of questions just so we can get through as many of them as possible. Because there was another question even. Well, actually, we could move on because there was a question about Paul, but there was another where if Jesus broke kind of cultural traditions and spoke to the woman at the well, for example, why didn't Jesus have women as part of the 12? Is a question here. I don't know if you feel like is it the same question, but even about female apostles? Maybe we keep them separate.
They're slightly separate questions, but I'll try and address them both. The answer why he didn't have a woman as one of the 12, I mean, the simple answer is I just don't know. Now, I'm going to speculate here, which I think I'm allowed to do, as long as I'm within certain limits. There is obviously a reason why there were 12 of them, right? 12 represents 12 tribes of Israel. And the 12 sons of Jacob, of course, obviously were all men. And I think Jesus wanted it to be clear what he was trying to do. He was trying to reconstitute Israel. Of course, in Matthew 10, verse 6, he actually says to the apostles, don't go to the Gentile nations, go only to the lost sheep of Israel. So Jesus's mission ultimately was to reconstitute Israel and then be the sort of ultimate representative of Israel himself. And so perhaps to preserve that continuity, he chose 12 men. Now, with that said, we know that the first witness of the resurrection was Mary Magdalene. Now, if what Luke says in Acts 1:22, Acts 1:21 and 22 is correct, that an apostle is a witness of the resurrection, well, the first apostle then technically was a woman, was Mary Magdalene. Now, we have to understand that we can kind of say apostle with a capital A referring to the 12. I think that's reasonable. But of course, apostle from the Greek word apostolos just means one who is sent. So in that sense, of course, Matthias rather replaces Judas, and he becomes a witness of the resurrection. Paul, of course, is referred to as an apostle. In Hebrews 3, verse 1, even Jesus is referred to as an apostle. So I think most likely the reason he had 12 men was to establish that continuity between Israel, because Jesus' mission was to rebuild the Israel, which would ultimately be the mouthpiece of God to the world through the church. Paul even says in Galatians 6:16, he uses the phrase the Israel of God to refer to the multi-ethnic people of God, not just Jews, all people who have faith in Jesus Christ. As for these female apostles, again, this connects to the previous question, as you said, and I do think this ought to be understood in the sense of a sent one. An apostle means one who has been sent. Now, there's major debate about Romans 16, verse 7, in this woman, Junia. Now, there are some people who think that there ought to be an S at the end of the name, Junias, which would actually make it a man. But it does seem to me that Andronicus and Junia are a husband and wife team. And the vast majority of scholars from across the theological spectrum argue that Junia is indeed a woman. There is even some problem with the translations. Some translations will say something along the lines of, and that they are highly esteemed by the apostles. But I would go with the majority view, which says she's outstanding. They are outstanding among the apostles, which suggests that that there were female emissaries. And like I mentioned, Euodia and Syntyche were clearly very important leaders in the Philippian church. There are some scholars who think that the entire book of Philippians is actually about Paul's attempt to reconcile Euodia and Syntyche. So that woman, and of course Mary Magdalene, when Jesus, the risen Christ, said to Mary, "Go tell Peter and my brothers that I am risen," preaching the risen Christ, that is the very central element of the gospel. And Jesus didn't say to Mary, "Go and find me an adequate man who can go and tell them." He sent Mary herself. She was the sent one to go and preach the risen Christ even to the 12. So you cannot lessen the impact of women in Jesus's ministry. They are absolutely central. They take pivotal roles in apostolic ministry in the first century.
Wow, fantastic. That's really, really helpful and encouraging, and probably stirring some thoughts for people. Just to state on that, just because I did see another question very related, and here it is here. I'm just going to pop this to the top, because you could probably just add a short clarification. It said here, Paul seemed to also view women as inferior. Was this cultural? Was this Jesus's view? I think the person that asked this question is obviously making some assumptions based off of certain texts of Paul's writings. How might you answer that? I think you've already answered that in many ways. So it's kind of might just be briefly, but how might you respond to that?
No, but it's a fair question, and the truth is, I mean, I have partly responded to it in terms of women in Paul's ministry. Yeah. There are certainly some texts in 1 Timothy 2, verse 11, for example, and 12, and in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 32 to 35. There is certainly some passage which would suggest that Paul thought women had a subordinate role. I can't think of one which contextually understood places women in an inferior role. So the passage in 1 Corinthians 14, where Paul says women should be silent in church, well, we've already seen that he said in 1 Corinthians 11 that women can pray and prophesy in church. We clearly can't mean that. The only thing he said is that they should keep their hair veiled so they're not basically confused with prostitutes. But it would seem, now this is, let's back up a second here, it's partly made more complex by the fact that in Greek, the word for woman and the word for wife is the same. The word gune can mean wife or woman. Now, it does seem in 1 Corinthians 14, when he says that women should be silent in church, that if they have something to ask, they should go and ask their husband at home. Now, clearly, Paul's not saying that married women should be quiet, but single women can shout from the rooftops. He's not imposing a ban on women speaking at all. What seems to be happening is that male prophets were getting up and saying something, and their wives were getting up and refuting their husband's prophecy, probably because they'd had an argument that morning or something. And so Paul was saying, look, go and sort out those problems at home. And if you think about it, that whole section of 1 Corinthians 12, 3-14 is all about orderly worship. The tongue speaking was disrupting the worship because it wasn't being interpreted and it was getting out of hand. So there were people saying that if your gifts aren't like my gifts, that you're not a part of the body, 1 Corinthians 12. So the entire passage is about orderly. The whole section 12-14 in 1 Corinthians is all about orderly worship. So that seems to make the best sense there. The passage in 1 Timothy 2 is far more tricky, where Paul seems to say that women shouldn't have authority over a man. And the reasoning he uses there is because Eve was the one who was deceived and not Adam. So it's really tricky thing that he's saying. But there's major difficulty linguistically with that passage. The verb that's translated have authority over should really be translated usurp authority. It's really should be understood that women shouldn't take authority from a man. And the reason that he's saying that is because, of course, Paul is writing in Ephesus. And Ephesus was a place where there was worship of a number of female deities, most commonly, who was the goddess at Ephesus? Name's gone.
Aphrodite?
I think it was Aphrodite, but there were at least two major temples. One's to Aphrodite, and I think there may even be one to Athena, or I can't remember. But because there was goddess worship, typically the sort of priestly roles in Ephesian worship, in Ephesian pagan worship, roles taken by women, and men were definitely second-class citizens in these sorts of pagan liturgies. And so what Paul seems to be saying here is that what you shouldn't do is be like the pagans. And in fact, what he then goes on to say is that women should learn in quiet submission. Now, again, what we know from the Roman context is that women's education was frowned upon. There was years of toing and froing, even so women could get very basic education in the empire. And so Paul was saying quite revolutionary pro-female things. And then when you consider, he says that there's no longer male and female, when you consider that he had all these female leaders in his circle, when you consider that, it was Chloe who was the person who's named for telling him what was going on in 1 Corinthians in the first place. She seems to have been some kind of patron of his in the Corinthian church. Far from Paul being a misogynist, in the ancient world, Paul would have been considered a feminist, not a misogynist. So I think those things ought to be understood contextually. And I think if you take the broad view of the most texts, this is not to say there aren't some tricky ones, but I think if you take the broad view of the majority of texts, Paul is clearly pro-female. Even in 1 Corinthians 7, in the advice about marriage, he doesn't just say the woman's body belongs to the man. He says both. He says your bodies belong to each other, completely contravening Roman conventions, where men felt like they owned their wives, and men, the majority of men, I may be exaggerating, but certainly a lot of men considered adultery as a pastime. Having lots of women was par the course. But then you had your wife, who had to be a good woman, stay at home, raise the kids, etc. So Paul was revolutionarily pro-female.
Wow, well that's very, very helpful, and I think I imagine again this is stirring some great thoughts for us. We may end up be inviting you back soon for some more discussions, even on this topic specifically, because I know this is obviously an ongoing conversation in Christendom in general, but in the churches, figuring out, okay, reassessing some scriptures on this. That's just very, very helpful thoughts. Thanks so much for that, Andy. And I think you've answered the apostle question well also, so we can move on from those. But thanks again, that was great. So next question here then, I'm changing gear a little bit into a slightly different angle. What would you say to the argument that Mohammed has had just as much impact as Jesus?
Well, you see, I don't want to get this turn this into kind of a league table and say, well, my prophets had more impact than your prophet. Obviously, to a Muslim, Muhammad would be the most impactful prophet. To a Jew, it would be Moses. To a Christian, it would be Jesus. To a Buddhist, it would be Siddhartha Gautama. To a Hindu, it might be Lord Krishna. We can sort of argue my prophet's better than your prophet, so to speak. But in terms of where I would say the impact is felt is in terms of how secular writers have engaged with these figures. And if you think about it, in the Quran, Jesus is actually quoted more than Muhammad, even in the Quran. So the truth is, in terms of impact, there's no question that Muhammad's impact has been huge. There's 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. There's no question that his impact has been enormous. But in terms of universal human history, I think you'd be very hard pushed to find anyone who has had an impact in the daily lives, even of the non-religious, as Jesus. So this is not to say that Muhammad hasn't had an impact. It's not to say that Lord Krishna or Moses or a load of other people, or even Abraham. Abraham, in many ways, sits atop all three of the monotheistic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So I certainly wouldn't engage in an argument with someone saying, "Oh, well, my prophet's better than your prophet." But I would simply say that if you look at sort of secular human history, I don't think if you were to collate the kinds of categories that I was talking about, and even others that I didn't mention, that anyone has impacted the world as much as Jesus. There's certainly no one has had as many books written about him. There's certainly no one who has affected as many religious traditions. I mean, if you think about it, Jesus is believed to be the Messiah, although they believe that means something slightly different in Islam. They believe that Jesus will return. They believe that he'll begin the judgment. They believe in his miraculous ministry. They believe in the virgin birth. So Jesus has influenced all sorts of even religious and philosophical ideals. I'd say to an even greater degree than Muhammad has. But having said that, I would never downplay. We ought not to downplay sometimes I think the influence of Islam, particularly in science, Islam is routinely downplayed. In the Middle Ages, in Europe, European philosophy would have effectively forgotten about Plato were it not for Islamic philosophers. Islamic philosophers and Islamic medical specialists are the ones who actually preserved the Greek philosophical tradition through the Middle Ages. And so we ought not to downplay that in any way.
Great. Wow, that's very, very helpful. Yeah, I think it's a very, very thorough answer to that question. Thanks so much. Okay, just to give a little short kind of break and announcement again here, guys. So again, just a reminder, you can upvote these questions, which many of you are doing. Because I see we've got about 19 questions, big long list here. Sorry, probably gave you a little bit of a head spin scrolling through that so quickly. But we're not going to be able to get to all of these questions. So just a forewarning. Okay, so if you have a little look on these questions, you can upvote the ones you want to answer, because we might go for maybe 10 more minutes here and allow Andy to answer a couple more questions. So upvote the ones you would like to have answered, and we're going to go keep going down from the top of the list. So one here, Andy, why is Jesus always portrayed as Caucasian in paintings when he is from the Middle East?
There's a short answer, a long answer to that. I'll just give you the short answer. The short answer is this. He's portrayed as Caucasian so that imperialists, colonialists, and racists could legitimize the dehumanization of non-Caucasian peoples. I think it was true of the kind of philosophy in much missionary activity. That's not to say that all missionaries were horrible racists. That's absolutely not true. And in fact, even if you go to many parts of Africa today, missionaries are celebrated. They're not hated. But oftentimes missionary activity was a Trojan horse for Western colonialism. Now, you couldn't do that if you were enslaving people or trying to marginalize people under the guise of a faith where the leader of that faith looked more like the people you were marginalizing than looked like you. Similarly, with the slave owners, you couldn't have Jesus as a person of color and own slaves. It would just be, I think, visually very distressing. Now, the truth is, throughout the years, any visual images of Jesus generally reflect the painter or members of the painter's family. So a lot of the most famous paintings came from, European Renaissance artists, or even artists from earlier, from near towards the Middle Ages. So they would often just base their Jesus on people that they knew, which is why, you kind of get this almost standardized look of Jesus. Jesus kind of generally has this one look because the earliest paintings were based on people that the painter knew, and then other painters just sort of followed suit. Jesus is obviously not Caucasian. I agree with Vincent Wimbush from Claremont University that he would look like a sort of Palestinian Jew of today. He'd have olivey looking skin. He'd be sort of tonally somewhere between me and you, Jack. Would have had a beard, probably, dark features. So, to me, it's purely a matter of history. It's not a matter of preference. It's not a matter of I want my Jesus to look like this. It's purely a matter of history, that someone from that part of the world would not look like a Scandinavian. And that's no offense to those who are from Scandinavia. That's just me saying that Jesus didn't have long hair and blue eyes.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. And I popped a question to the top here just because you've already touched on it. So I wondered if you could respond to this. What do you say in response to people who claim that the Bible was just a tool used to enslave others?
I'd say you're right. It was used by some. It absolutely was used by some people to enslave others. The Bible's been used to do all kinds of things, which is why the Apostle James talks about motivations. You ask for things, but you ask with the wrong motives. If the motivation behind the use of any text, whether it's the only reason the Bible takes center stage is because it is the prominent text of all human history. It's the most influential. It's the number one bestseller of all time, forever, and then that will never ever be different. The Bible. How many English translations are there now of the Bible? There are literally probably over 100 just common ones. Yeah. And this is just English. This is not to mention the equivalents in every other language in the world. So the Bible is a hugely influential text. In many ways, whoever kind of controls the Bible in a way can control the world. And this routinely did happen. Now, to me, the very obvious thing is that if people actually read the texts in English, I'm talking about any special, clever exegetical tricks. If people just read the texts and heeded those texts, there is no way that human history could have been the way that it was. It was because other agendas and other motivations took over. And of course, you know, there are passages in 1 Peter 3 which say, slaves, obey your masters. In Colossians towards the end of Colossians 3, slaves, obey your masters. Now, if they had read Colossians 4, where it said, masters, be humane to your slaves, understanding that you too have a master in heaven, there's no way you can explain the transatlantic slave trade. It happened because people were deliberately selective about which texts they employed, because those texts were employed to meet other agendas. They were not the agendas of Jesus.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really helpful answer. And I guess perhaps to ask you just to elaborate a tiny bit more, because if we read the question as, what do you say in response to people who claim that the Bible was just a tool to enslave?
Right. It was
you've
just
kind of answered. I think you've kind of answered that already, but some people dismiss the Bible for that reason, don't they? Because it's been used poorly.
Well, again, I'd say two things. First of all, the Bible recognizes slavery as a practice. And I think one question that comes up often is, well, why doesn't the Bible just outright sort of condemn slavery? There are a few reasons for that, I think. Number one, I think to try to sort of condemn slavery in the ancient world would almost be trying to condemn capitalism today. The ancient world was built on slavery. Around the time of Jesus and certainly of Paul, roughly a third of the empire were slaves. And slavery in the ancient world, most slaves were either prisoners of war or people who had sold themselves into slavery in order to pay back debts. That's what most slavery was about. So the transatlantic slave trade and some of the sort of, people trafficking and some of the more modern examples of slavery are nothing like ancient forms of slavery. Slavery was almost, now you were still chattel, you were still property, you were owned by people. But slavery, you've got to be very careful how you compare ancient slavery and modern slavery. There clearly are parallels, but they're not necessarily the same phenomenon. Now, the second thing is that, in fact, at times, the biblical writers actually do encourage the ending of slavery. When Paul wrote to Philemon, he said, don't just take him back as a slave, take him back as a brother. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says, to people who are he's already said to people, stay in whatever situation you were called. Were you married when you were called? Stay married. Were you single when you were called? Stay single. Were you a slave when you were called? Stay a slave. But then he says, but if you can gain your freedom, then do so. So there are countercultural streaks in the New Testament. There's no question that there are. But people who say that the Bible was just a tool used to enslave others, again, the truth is any tool can be used depending on the motivation of the user. And this goes back to what I said before. The reason the Bible becomes so powerful is because people have such deep respect for the Bible. People believe or at least take up the beliefs of the ancient church. They take the beliefs of the ancient church seriously, and many try to base their lives on the beliefs of the ancient church. So the Bible is a serious work of literature. It's not just any old book, and people have recognized that. But when human motivations take over, then any document of antiquity or modernity can be used to promote evil. There's no question. But I think simply reject the Bible on that basis, to me, betrays a lack of understanding of the text itself. I don't think any right-thinking person reading the Bible today could say that this text only has power to enslave. For the majority of readers of the New Testament, the Bible actually is a liberating document. It's interesting that although many of the slave owners, slave traders, and slave marketers were church-going people, some of them were even clergy, how did slavery end? Well, it ended because of people reflecting on the Bible. It was William Wilberforce and people reflecting on the biblical text that ended slavery. So just as it can be used to enslave, it can be used to liberate. But you have to understand, A, your own motivations, and B, the motivations of the original authors. And the motivation of the original authors were redemptive. And that's what redemption means. It means to purchase something back so that it's no longer enslaved. And so the purposes of the biblical authors was to redeem. It was to play their role in the great work of redemption that God is doing. So the Bible, if it's analyzed from the context of its original authors, is a document of liberation. But of course, like any document, if it's twisted, it can be used to enslave. And as we read about in 2 Peter 3, there are people who were even taking Paul's words, which were all about liberation, and they were twisting them. And so liberation now suddenly became a license to sin. Well, we're free from the law, so we can go and do what we want. Easily, you can take the words of the biblical author, completely decontextualize them, recontextualize them in whatever context you want, and make them mean anything you want. But I don't think any sound reading of the Bible on the with the understanding of the author's own intention could simply see it as a tool to enslave.
Wow. Thank you. Incredibly helpful, powerful answer. I'm sure it's cleared up a lot of different things for us there. So thank you so much. That's great. Okay, my challenge here, Andy, we're running really short on time, so we only have a couple of minutes left. That last question there is quite a big one. So I don't know if I want to kind of throw that at you with only a few minutes to answer it, unless you feel like you have
Which question?
Well, the top question here is Christianity.
The top one.
It's a response to your one of the points you made in the talk. If Christianity helped end the infanticide in the Roman world, how would you address modern day abortion and the rights of women to choose termination? It's a big topic. I know it's a bit of a controversial one, so don't feel like you need to answer it now. In a few minutes, but
well, I'll start to unpick it. It's something which it's actually the whole questions. A friend of mine sent me an email today because the whole thing's been reignited because of the coronavirus vaccine, which is actually being manufactured from the cells which were taken from an aborted fetus. And this is how a lot of scientific research goes on. They use the cells of aborted fetuses, they process those cells, and they do tests on them. And these were sort of kidney cells from an aborted fetus, which they're using to develop a coronavirus vaccine. And many people are asking the moral question, well, if abortion is wrong, then should we use a vaccine that's based, that's developed from an aborted fetus? I would say this. And again, I'm you're right. I don't have much time here, so if my answers sound stupid to you, that's it's partly because I'm not an expert on this, but partly because I haven't had time to develop the answer. I think some of the ways that Christians defend their anti-abortionist stance are not particularly persuasive. People using the Psalms to sort of say, I knew you from birth and this kind of thing. The Psalms are poetic. And you see what happens is that sometimes, like for example, when the author of Psalm 137 says, "Blessed is the one who dashes their babies against the rocks," talking about how the Israelites felt about the Babylonians, it's completely over emotional, symbolic thing. We go, oh, that's figurative. But then when the psalmist says something like, "I knit you in the womb," we go, oh, well, that's literal. And so abortion's wrong. Well, you can't pick and choose. You can't decide which psalm is literal and which is figurative based on the point you wish to make. My own reasons for generally being against abortion are that God is the arbiter of life and death. Jesus is the one who has rule over life and death. And so I think it's problematic. I don't want to draw an absolute line under it, but I think it's highly problematic when we take that place. Now, what most feminist commentators would say is it's a woman's body, and nobody has the right to come into a woman's body and say, you cannot do what you want with your own body.
Yeah.
My deep problem with that is that the same feminists would still argue for a limit on the age where a fetus can be aborted, however many weeks it is where you can abort a fetus. But you see, based on their argument, based on this is my body, you can't tell me what I can do with it, there's nothing to say that if you decide to end your pregnancy 6 months in, well, then it's still your body, it's the same body. So could you abort the baby then? Could you kill the baby then? on that argument, you could. So I'm not persuaded by that either. Then people say, well, what about, you know, rape victims or people who know that their baby will be born hugely deformed, will have no kind of life and probably die in 2 weeks or whatever. These are, of course, hugely sensitive, thorny, emotional questions. And me as a man, I almost don't feel like I even have a right to speak about what they should do. I suppose the thing I think, speaking as I say, as a man, and that already puts limits on what I can say, I think, is that God can do incredible things, and that who knows what the birth of any child might lead to, even the child born from something as ugly and horrible as a rape. I mean, there are people queuing up who can't have children and want to have children. Who knows what that child might bring to the world? Now, you know, I would never put myself in a place to say what a woman should do in those circumstances. But I think to simply reduce this to whether abortion's right or wrong, I think there are several more questions which need to be asked and need to be asked. I think, you know, philosophically and biblically, before we sort of draw hard lines in the sand. As probably tell from the way I'm speaking, I'm generally against hard lines in the sand unless there's very good, compelling reason for doing so.
No, I appreciate that. I know that's like I said, it's a very challenging topic.
Yeah, it's a massive question. It's a massive.
And there's lots of emotions to it, lots of layers to it.
Exactly.
In some way, it's helpful even us kind of asking this, just because, like you said, this will come to the surface even with the coronavirus vaccine and other things like that. This once again will be an issue we're going to have to really wrestle and pray with and think about, but and what it means. But Andy, I just want to thank you again so much for your talk, for everything you've shared, for the title of how Jesus changed the world, and I think you've given us lots to think about, lots to wrestle with. And there are still so many questions here that we haven't been able to answer. And what I do want to say as well is for everybody listening and watching in today, especially those of you who have answered questions, but I'm sure many of you have other questions that we haven't been able to answer, or just thoughts that you're wrestling with right now, perhaps even up to that very last question or others. I just want to encourage and urge you to please get in touch with us. This is what we love to do. We love to be able to answer questions like this. And ultimately, we really want to be able to help you and help support you on your journey of faith as you really kind of wrestle with some of these things and get to know who God really is. So there's multiple ways you can get in contact with us, even the message chats on YouTube. We've got our Facebook and Instagram in the description. You can email us directly. But we would love to be able to help you out. Even if you have questions about the Bible and would just like to ask some of those, we would really love to help you. So, Andy, I just want to say a huge thank you once again, and want to kind of leave you with any final words you might have to just wrap up this evening.
I think the question of who Jesus is and what Jesus did is perhaps the most central question that anyone who seriously reflects on their life and on the world, and goodness knows in this, you know, in 2020, we've had more time to think and reflect perhaps even than we normally do. So if you haven't asked that question, or even if you already believe and you're still mulling over that question, take the time to research it, to study it, to consider it from the biblical text, to consider it in as many angles as you can do. As complex and as controversial a figure as Jesus is, I think there are incredibly strong reasons for asserting that he is the one true hope of humankind. He's the one true hope for restoring this fallen world. And so any time you spend researching him and trying to understand him is time well spent.
Fantastic. They are fantastic closing words. So one final huge thank you to you as well, Andy. And one final thank you to everybody listening and tuning in. And please, like I said again, get in touch with us, and we would love to be able to help you out. So thanks for joining us tonight. Thank you for being with us, and we will see you next time.
Cheers. Bye-bye.